If your kid was wanting to take a risk on themselves and pursue something, what would you tell them?
Do it.
And yet we have difficulty doing it for ourselves.
Hey, I'm Nick.
And I'm Graeme.
And this is the Dude, Where's My Code podcast. And this is episode number 8. Graeme, you and I were chatting. We got to have Zubin on the call with us. I think a super awesome source of information and different perspective to bring into engineering management.
I didn't know that much about him coming in, admittedly, and I didn't know what to expect. And it was really enlightening. He's got a lot of really neat ideas to share, especially about people and about, patterns that apply not just in engineering management, and bringing a bit of a broader perspective that I really appreciated.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of the most valuable, insightful conversations that was about engineering management without being about engineering management. So we think you're really going to enjoy it. If you can do us a favor, like and subscribe, and enjoy the rest of this. Take care. Cool. No, that's awesome. But I am genuinely interested. So I wanted to take a quick peek at LinkedIn right before you got on, because I know that there was some background pieces that I was missing. And I was like, okay, like Zubin, you've done a bunch of different stuff, including you had a startup as well. So I was curious, like kind of what that journey looked like, especially getting to a point where startup and then legal and then software engineering, like that's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. Well, when you've been around a while like me, when you're an older dude, you got time to do a lot of stuff. So that's what happens.
You're giving us too much credit.
Well, so I didn't intend to be an engineer, right? I tried to code. I wanted to learn to code for many years, and I tried for 4.5 years. I tried and tried so that I could do the startup thing, because I wanted to do the startup thing. And then that's kind of how I went into it. And that was while I was still in the law. And then I changed career from the law into sort of management. And I was still trying to do this on the side, trying to teach myself to code, because I frankly fell for this myth that you can teach yourself. You can learn anything, but you may not be able to teach yourself anything. Like this, teaching yourself is a hard thing. It takes a lot of grit. It takes a lot of persistence, the right plan. And we could grow our own food. We could make our own clothes. We could make our own shoes. We could do all of these things. The reason we don't is because there is efficiencies to be gotten by not doing everything yourself, right? Same thing in engineering management decisions. Do we roll our own, or do we build our own, or do we buy? Right?
Always build your own.
Always build your own. Absolutely. That's how you get more headcount, right? Exactly. So, it's the same principle. DIY is build your own. Same principle, right? And so I sort of have all these meta principles, meta frameworks that I work with. Yeah, so I ended up, sorry to jump around a bit here, but I ended up going into the startup world a few times. The first 3 startups are not startups, because I got, developers overseas to build something, and they're still sitting on my Google Drive because I didn't know what to do with them when they gave it to me. They're like, deploy this on a server. I'm like, what is deploy? What is server? Like, I genuinely did not know all this. I didn't know what that meant. Well, you have to build it. I'm like, what is building? I had no idea. And this is after 2 years of trying to teach myself to code, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, I started the startup. I ended up quitting management life to go all in at 36, I think I was. I'm like, if I don't do this now, I'll never do it. Take the risk, take the big step, do it. I did it. And I had to hire a team here in Australia, because I'd learned from experience that doing it overseas doesn't work. I did it with a bunch of people in Australia, spent 6 figures building the product, launching it, got 8,000 users, was successful. Wow. As a launch, it was successful. And then not commercially, but as a launch, it was successful. And I had a bunch of contracts with local councils to deliver the proofs of concept. Mm-hmm. Along the way, one of the guys who built it ended up saying, I'll be your fractional CTO. Give me some equity. I really love what you're doing here. I believe in you. I've seen the amount of grit. The funny thing is, when I first started, no one wanted to work with me. But when they saw the effort I put in, suddenly people are like, okay, you're for real. And that was a big lesson. People will follow you if they think you're real. And they can see evidence, right? So he did, and he jumped on board, but then his partner got pregnant, and so he quit after 5 months because he couldn't take the risk anymore, obviously. Sure. Left me holding the baby, proverbially speaking. And so I had all these contracts with my early proof of concept customers to deliver on. And so I had no choice at that point in time but to fix some of the code and update it. And so that was my 5th attempt, and that's when I think I finally realized, okay, I need to do this, and I did it. And then the business was clearly not going to survive. The unit economics were bad. And again, big lesson, just because you build a product doesn't mean diddly squat in terms of commercial success. Just like I keep telling my students, because I coach people as well on career change. I'm like, just because you learn to code doesn't mean you're going to become a coder. It's not enough. It's just isn't. It's just like writing a book is not enough to become a published author. The biggest part is actually getting an agent and getting an editor and then getting to market. That's harder than writing the book, So I taught myself to code and decided I'm shutting down the business. I could go back to being an executive again and, earn really good money, or because I have no kids by choice, I was like, I could start all over again, finally do what I wanted to do for the last 8 years.
And it was something you wanted to do, right? Like you said you were trying to code, like you want to go do this.
Yes. I wanted to be able to create things, write code. I wanted to be part of technology. I grew up in the 90s. I went to law school in the early 90s. 98, I went into law school. 2003, I came out. Now, I know whether you guys are, sort of old enough to remember this, but 98, there was no Google. 2003, Google was getting ready to be listed. Like literally the .com boom, the .com crash, all of it happened in those 5 years. Google became a thing. Lycos, Alta Vista went out the window. Yahoo was on the decline. There was no Facebook. There was none of the stuff that we know in the world today. Like it was that 5-year period that I was in law school, the whole world changed. And I wasn't part of it, right? So I came out the other end saying, we're in a new century. The whole world's changed. I'm in this path and I've got momentum taking me forward and I want to be in this path for a while. But a part of me knew the world was changing and I wasn't being part of that change, right? And I spent the next 14 years trying to figure out how to be part of that change, right? So from the time when when Gmail was a thing, Google almost went public, Facebook became a thing, the first iPhone came out, the GFC, all of this was happening. And I was watching it from the sidelines as a lawyer thinking, I want to be part of this somehow, but I don't know how. So that's really the genesis story. And eventually when I became a coder, it wasn't because I knew I wanted to be a coder. It was I knew I didn't want to go back to the life I'd left behind because it was too tempting to do that, to go back to what I knew. If I wanted to leave once, I'm going to want to leave it again.
That's a very good reflection because I'm thinking for people that maybe haven't been in a position where they've started work and stuff like that, they're like, well, you have this opportunity to go back to something that was clearly going well. Why would you not do that? Law, that would be awesome. That would be so secure. It would be silly to toss that away, but it's so cool to hear that you're it's that reflection. If I left once, it's because I didn't want to be there. It's not what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and when have we ever succeeded when we repeated the same mistake and expected a different outcome? Cause and effect, right? You do the same thing, you'll get the same result. And I'm like, I don't want to do that.
I'm just really curious about this because I know for myself, if I'm being honest with myself, I could not do this. I am terrible at getting uncomfortable. I've had success in my career and in different stages of my life because things have almost forced me to be uncomfortable. But if someone left me and they were like, Nick, if you can just keep going down a path, I would be like, where's the path of least resistance over and over? I like to think about it kind of what you were saying earlier about efficiencies. It's more efficient if I stay on this path. But what I never realized for myself is when I have these forcing functions, it's like a forcing step function a lot of the time, right? I get uncomfortable. I'm like, oh, this sucks so much. And then I'm like, wait a second, this is actually awesome. So I'm just very curious when you're going through this thought process, how did you talk yourself out of it's comfortable and it's enough for me to go get uncomfortable. I want that.
Wow. Great question, man. See, the honest answer, the thing is I'm mindful that anything I say now, it's different from when I started the journey. The world was a different place. There was no influencer. There was no TikTok. There was no 30-second piece of BS that makes people believe so. So I'm going to give you the truth with the caveat that it's so compressed that it's probably losing a lot of signal in compression.
Sure, that's fair.
Right? And that's what's going to happen. So it was incredibly hard. Not the actual process. When I went to do the startup thing and I left my income and I spent 6 figures of my savings from the mortgage for 2 years, no income coming in, lots of outgoings, I didn't die of starvation. I was able to keep the lights on. I hustled to get side gigs every now and then in consulting so that I could keep the lights on. my lifestyle went back a little bit. Yeah, I didn't chill out as much. I didn't spend. I was a little more money conscious, but nothing fatal or serious happened. Nothing threatening happened. But before I did it, my mind was a battlefield of disaster. It was like, oh, it's the end of the world. All right. So first thing, big lesson, it's much worse in your head than it is in real life. Like, and the funny thing, the Stoics have said this. You suffer more in your imagination than you suffer in real life, right? Seneca said this 2,000 years ago. We suffer more in imagination than we do in real life. Great lesson, okay? But I knew that, and I still had to live it myself before it really landed. So that was one. Yeah. The second thing is, I found a hack that I use with my students, and I hate the word hack, so I shouldn't use it. Why am I using it? I found a technique that works better. We all know the answer, but we don't do it. Okay, and here's a simple way to illustrate this to you. Do either of you have kids?
I do.
You do. All right, Graeme. If your kid was wanting to take a risk on themselves and pursue something, what would you tell them?
Do it.
And yet we have difficulty doing it for ourselves.
That's right.
Right? When I realized that, because I don't have kids, I was watching all the people around me bringing up their kids, and I realized, hang on, they're telling their kids what's right, but they wouldn't do it for themselves. So we already know what's right, and we can tell others what to do. We preach, but we don't practice because it's really hard. But we already know the answer. So maybe the answer is do the thing you already know you need to do, but don't want to do. Right? And then it brings me to the third piece. You kind of have to have faith. And faith, like respect, is earned. You have to earn your faith in yourself by having faith in yourself, by doing the thing that produces faith, that also produces self-trust.
Right.
And that takes time. It takes a long time. So this is not a 90-second thing. This is not something you can do in a weekend with a cold shower. That stuff is useless.
I think what I'm hearing from you that resonates with me as well is that when something is like nagging at you or eating away at you over time, there often is a tipping point, at least in my own experience, of something doesn't feel quite right. Like I'm comfortable, but I'm not happy, or whatever that is. And the longer you sit with that, eventually it comes to this point where you go, maybe my happiness is worth more than this level of comfort that I have today. And it does kind of drive you in that direction. I mean, I've done the same thing. I haven't done a heavy career change, but I've certainly done a refocus of where I apply my skills in technology and engineering. And it was the same thing. It was like, I'm pursuing, the best position I can get in whatever domain. I don't care. And then it started to be like, I kind of care about what I do and what I'm building and who I'm building for. And the longer I sat with that, it was like, perhaps I can step away from this like comfy, cozy salary and relatively safe ecosystem and look for something that's a little more risky, but really fits the profile of what I want. And it was a day that I sat down and wrote down what I wanted and started that journey. And it just was after enough time of like, today's the day, write it down, make it happen.
So Nick, Graeme, do you mind sharing a bit more about that? If I ask you something?
Of course.
Obviously, again, you compressed a lot of it, right? And you sat down, wrote down, and then you had to just take the action. But that entire lead-up process, that's where most people stew for the longest and so uncomfortable, right? And it blocks you. Can you remember and tell us some of the voices in your head, what they were saying? Your fears. Just give them a voice for a moment.
Oh, gosh. Like as I was kind of like starting to recognize on discomfort. Oh boy. Okay, let's think about it. So early in my career, this comes up a lot. Nick and I worked at a startup that was very mission driven and very kind of like people focused. And I think I got to the point where I was like yearning for the old days of working at that company. And I start seeing the cracks in what I'm doing day to day. I was building software for the construction industry, which is a totally fine industry, but I couldn't necessarily see the benefit of what we were building at a personal level. It was a very corporate level. And I've worked at enough companies where you start to identify the stories that they're telling and they feel like a little bit of a stretch, maybe a little bit of BS. Like well, our software makes people's jobs more efficient so that they could go home to their kids sooner. Hold on. Like, I don't know how I feel about this. And so, yeah, there was definitely kind of a day-to-day discontent and kind of disheartening feeling about where my efforts were being placed. And I even started to look for things, what can I do on the side to feed some of this desire? I want to do good for people. I want to help the world. Maybe there's opportunities to do that. And then it got to the point where it was like, I have a skill set. I'm using it for something. Let's apply that. And yeah, that was that was easily a 6-month process for me. I'm sure it's different for everybody.
Why do you think it took that long? Like, why didn't you just, the moment you had this realization and insight, So for those not watching, money, right?
It's all about the money. Yeah,
you need to keep the lights on. So that's a major reason why people don't take action, is because the cost of action is so great, and yet you ended up doing it. What was the fear you needed to overcome in order to finally do it? Because the money thing didn't go away. Like, as we get older, we need more money.
That is a tough and complicated question. It gets to the kind of like, yeah, I mean, of course. There's a couple things. So for me, one, there was other things taking place at the same time that were a very nice intersection, which was myself, my wife, my family decided we really wanted to step back a little bit from kind of the rat race or the keeping up with the Joneses, or however you want to describe it. We were looking for a slightly simpler life. And it actually became this thing of, well, we can kind of force ourselves into that by me also being able to pursue happiness in career instead of money in career. And, like, I was always taught growing up, and it was one of those things your parents tell you, and I hated hearing it, but I have seen the reality is you'll spend to what you make and you will live to what you make. And so adjusting that up, you'll spend more, but adjusting that down is the exact same thing. You'll be fine, relatively speaking. So that kind of was a good intersection. And then, as fate would have it, as I started applying to the places that were more in line with what I was looking for, my startup decided they didn't have enough runway in the current economy to survive with the size that they had. And so I was part of kind of a sweeping layoff. And that was the final forcing function to say, well, instead of going and pursuing another of the same, I've already planned for this. Don't panic. This is now the time to take those efforts and really focus them where I want to go. And 3 weeks later, I was in the space I wanted to be in. So
right. And so it sounds like your own learning, you had your own process of evolution, then you reasoned, you sort of reasoned, and concluded, right? In many senses, that's what even engineering management is about. It's a PIR. Yeah. Right? It's a PIR on your life. And this is why I keep saying there are these meta principles that apply in everything from parenting to engineering management to career change. And if you unlock those meta principles, and by the way, they've been known 3,000 years, of written history shows that people have known these meta principles. That's the lever, that moves the work. That's really what matters.
Yeah, we're almost like our own worst enemies a lot of the time, because a lot of the self-talk it's negative or it's doubt, and I'm certainly someone who does a lot of that. I know there's a couple of things you said already. I'm like, if my wife were watching this, she'd be like, I hope you're taking notes, Nick, because I tell you this all the time.
It's for all of us. Look, I've had the privilege when I worked at the UN, for example, briefly. I've met some heads of state where I realized they were just like the rest of us. I've seen people, you'd be astonished, I can't name names, but I've seen people before they go on stage having their little ritual in the back, in the wings, trying to get the people that you would never have guessed, were going to be struggling on stage. And because they don't show it. Once they come out, they're in the moment and they do it. But the amount of psychological training it takes to do that, is astounding. And that's when I realized this is the human condition. This is not special no matter what LinkedIn or Twitter says, this is not special to this profession. We're human beings having a human experience, right? Which includes this.
I do love your perspective on this. And interestingly, my favorite book that has influenced the way I manage is a book called The Culture Code by an author, Daniel Coyle. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he went and what he did was investigated high-performing groups of individuals, high-performing teams. And what's interesting is one of the groups he looked at was in software. I think it might have been Zapier or something. I forget exactly. And then on top of that, there was other groups. So there's kind of the classic Navy SEALs. There was Pixar, how successful Pixar was. There was a group of successful jewelry thieves. And I forget the other ones. But he did these case studies with these groups and looked for common elements across the groups. And it was so eye-opening to me because I love the lessons I took from the book, but it's not an engineering management book. It's a how do we build teams that can align around a value and perform at a high degree. And I just that has been so essential to me. So to hear you talk about meta principles and how engineering leadership isn't some special snowflake totally resonates. And I don't think about that day to day. I think I'm often, as I'm leading my team, thinking purely in the context of engineering. I mean, I think about people, but it's also how do we apply it to this engineering context? And I think when I reflect on some of the greatest lessons I learned, at least reading from this book, it's actually, it might make sense to subtract the engineering out of it some of the time.
But when you look at it, a lot of engineering principles are meta principles in themselves. So the concept of peer review, it's what a code review is. Rollbacks is basically the scientific method. You try something out. If it doesn't work, you roll it back. You change. The MVP cycle, the build, measure, learn cycle. What are the other principles in engineering? The fact that you want to test things all the time means that you're looking for disconfirming evidence that proves that your path is right. It's the same principle. It's the same thing applied to engineering, and the engineering mindset is particularly helpful for life, which is a weird thing because when you think about it, if we applied a professional standard, Nick, maybe your wife is listening to this bit and is going to raise an eyebrow, but if we applied a professional standard to our personal lives, and I'm deliberately holding these at two different levels, we will improve in our personal life. Right? The reality is we don't apply a professional standard to our personal lives, to our fitness, to our health, to our mindset, to our budget. We don't do this. And even in parenting, we will tell kids things that we know is right and not do it ourselves. That's applying a different standard for them and a different standard for us. And when we narrow these two, professional and personal standards, I think it unlocks a whole lot of things in life and success, whether it's engineering management, whether it's engineering, parenting, whatever. These are meta principles.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The perspective I was trying to add in earlier when we were riffing a little bit was this is awesome because I totally agree. And the thing that I was trying to call out was sometimes I feel like engineering and engineering management does feel special, not because it is unique, because I don't think it is. After when you frame it this way, I don't think it is unique. But I think the fact that there's so little emphasis socialized about what I would call human skills, and the fact that you're bringing up these meta principles, I think there's so little emphasis on that compared to just how can I up level my coding, right? It's so hyper focused on very technical details that as a result, as engineering managers, it's almost like we end up having to hyper focus on all these people skills because they're not, I'm generalizing, so I don't want to insult anyone, but a lot of the time these things are lacking in comparison to a lot of the technical skills. So we have to overemphasize them. It does make it feel special, but it shouldn't be.
I think your point is right. I think it's just a question of inflating the one tire that's a little underinflated compared to the others in the car, right? It needs to be brought up. You need all four to run. And it's interesting you talk about this habit or this subculture or this culture in engineering where we focus so much on the technical. So as an outsider, I have a theory on that because I've come from a background that didn't have that.
Right.
And here's my I blame the compiler for that culture. Right. And here's why. The compiler fundamentally has two attributes. It is deterministic in that inputs will produce the same output. and it gives you immediate feedback, unequivocally.
Immediate, but yes, okay.
Immediate. Like it'll tell you, I don't like what you've done, I'm going to complain. Now, when you work with human beings, that is not the case. It's neither deterministic nor is the feedback immediate. In fact, it is highly probabilistic, extremely context specific, culture specific, communication specific, language specific, right? And what gets said is not what gets understood, which is not the case when it comes to compiler, right?
That's very interesting.
Yeah, because I was like, I now understand why the engineers have this stereotype attached to them. When I started working with code, I'm like, I get it, because this world is immediate feedback and it's deterministic. You write the same line of X code, I write the same line of X code, we're going to get the same result. It does not discriminate my context. Its mood doesn't matter. Whether it's hungry, it's blood sugar, doesn't, irrelevant. And so it strips away all that rubbish and just gives you results, feedback, deterministically. Whereas life is not like that. And organizations and systems are definitely not like that, because cause and effect gets lost in the system, right? And engineers, if I'd been an engineer, or if I'd been coding since I was a teenager and that was the world I got to grow up in only or largely, that would have influenced my mental model of everything else. And anything else that didn't fit that would have been uncomfortable, threatening, and unlikable, to be honest. Because I'm like, why the hell do I have to deal with that crap?
It's challenging in comparison, right? I think if you take that frame of reference of give input to compiler gives you it's deterministic, right? I think that's a very good way to put it. When you're used to being able to put out feelers like that, getting deterministic results, as soon as you don't have that, like, why would you want that? Like, you would want to try and avoid it because it's uncomfortable.
Correct. And so that's the second limb of the theory, exactly as you said, Nick, is that evolutionary biology makes it unpleasant to deal with that, because we want to pursue pleasure and not pain. Now, we know the brain responds really positively to immediate feedback consistently. Okay, inconsistent and non-deterministic feedback is extremely traumatic for the brain because it's very hard to deal with. And so it's going to make you want to not deal with it. It's going to push you away from it. And so that's why coding is also something you can get into a flow with, why I find it so addictive. It's because when there's a coding problem, I know there's a solution. I just had to find it. I don't doubt there's a solution. But when it comes to people, that's not true.
Right.
That cannot be true. I don't know there's a solution. When it comes to this is why I think business and sales is in some respects a much harder skill than engineering, because it is completely non-deterministic. You do not know what's going to work.
It's funny, like one of the things that I bring up in like software engineering conversations a lot, and it's very close to what you just said, is I say the hardest thing in software engineering is not the technical part. I'm like, engineers are very smart people. If you give them a problem, they will find a solution. They'll do it. I always say the hardest part is the peopling. Like, you put people together and all of a sudden there's a lot of friction, but it's interesting. I'd never really kind of, connected the dots this way. And thanks to your analogy, I think it's really helpful. It's like part of that friction is likely because like people aren't stereotypically people aren't used to having, that not deterministic feedback. They're kind of like, oh, like this is why it's hard.
Right. And culture plays a big part in this. Like I work for American companies a lot. I work for Asian companies. I work for all sorts of companies. And the feedback culture itself is different, right? Some cultures are very much a poker face. So you don't get any feedback. Some cultures they will tell you, like the American culture I found in my experience can be much more direct than some indirect cultures like the British culture, the Aussie culture, which is a little more circumspect, and that's just culture, right? And so when you're giving feedback to somebody, whether it's good, negative, better, whatever it is, it's hard to know how it's landing. There's no compiler telling you. There's no squiggly line on the person's face, saying, I don't like what you've just done.
And if you repeated it to someone else, you could take the exact same thing and repeat it. You get a different result, and you're like, oh, no.
1,000%, Nick. What works for one, and heck, we know this with kids as well. What works for one sibling doesn't work for the other. It's a hard problem, and it's extremely frustrating, and it produces insecurity because you don't know how to be effective in that level of uncertainty, right? That level of uncertainty. And so that's why to be a good engineering manager, and the best I've only had a few engineering managers. I've had really good ones, but that's because I'm very intentional about my career now that I'm in my 40s. So at Google and at Chainlink, where I am now, excellent managers. But for a big period of my life before that, I didn't have consistently good managers. I've had some great managers. I've had some not so great ones.
Sure.
But the funny thing is, the good managers in engineering share the exact same attributes as the good managers I've had outside of engineering. Right? Which is they were able to identify what I needed. They were able to coach me. They were able to pay attention. They were able to spend the time. And they did not castigate mistakes. Right? They would definitely hold your feet to the fire if it warranted it, but they would never not love you for it.
Sure.
Which is a very human thing. It's a very deeply human thing. And that's what makes a good manager to my perspective. The technical skills, you can kind of learn that, and not all managers will have it, nor should they be expected to have as much technical skill as everybody else. That's an unfair expectation.
I actually wanted to ask you about that because the qualities you listed, in my opinion, none of them were like, and they know C# really well. They are a JavaScript expert. They actually invented JavaScript. That's why they're the best manager. And I know different companies, like at Microsoft, they will say, like, we do expect our managers to be technical. I don't have to code as part of my role, but they have an expectation of technical expertise. I'm fortunate that I love to program, so that works out for me. But I've had this conversation with people, and I've said, like, for me, like personally, I lean into having technical skills on the programming side. I lean into that not because I can go code things for people, but it helps me communicate better. So if I'm trying to work with people on my team and they're having different challenges, if it happens to be code related, I can speak to them at that level and I can kind of get on the same page for communicating. But like, I've also had managers, and I've had both sides where managers were not technical and it was not good. And I've had managers that were not technical and it was totally fine. They were amazing. And I feel like, and I want to get your thoughts on this, but for me, the non-technical managers that were still amazing, it's because they could communicate. Like, we could find a good level to communicate at where I could give them enough detail and they could meet me there and we could basically just get on the same page about what we were discussing. But it never seemed to be a limitation that was consistent. And I'm curious if that's been your experience.
Oh, 1000%, both in engineering and when I was in my, sort of more commercial management role. And interestingly, Nick and Graeme, in the law, like, the law is interesting as well in that it's a technical profession. And so what happens in very technical professions is people achieve seniority for technical prowess, but they end up being really rubbish managers, really bad.
We talk about this all the time, yeah.
Right? And so that's because the incentive mechanisms are not aligned. But that's also partly a cultural thing. A junior lawyer will probably not respect a technically unsound senior lawyer. Just like a junior engineer will probably want a technically sound manager, Right. What needs to change in that is, even if because of the pace of change, and a manager's allocation is a more strategic resource rather than an implementational resource, as the more sort of higher you go, what needs to change is the culture around the expectations of the manager. The manager's job is not to know what is not to be able to do your job. Mm-hmm. Right. The manager's job is to be able to help you do your job. Huge difference, massive cultural shift. One is getting out of the way, and the other is being fungible. Right?
Yeah.
You do not have to be an alternative to the IC. You just have to help the IC get their job done. That's what a good manager is.
I wrote it down a long time ago. Well, I guess it's not that long ago, a couple of years maybe. There's a quote, and you have to be an F1 fan to appreciate it. But in Formula One, Mercedes was the winning team for like 9 years in a row. Toto Wolff led the team, and there's a quote in the TV series that I wrote. I paused it and was like, I got to write this down, because he said,
"Is this from Drive?"
From Drive to Survive. Yeah, I think it's in, like, I don't remember, season 2 early on. And Toto Wolff said, I don't know how to develop an aerodynamic surface. I don't know how to drive the car fast. Like, he listed a bunch of things that the team does to make the car successful. He said, but I know who the person in the room is who can do that. And my job is to make them able to do that the best they can. And I was like, oh my God, like, engineering management 101. Like, I certainly don't know. And I think if you look at my personal bio, probably on my website, I said something like, I'm not the right person to be debugging a production incident by myself. right? I should not be in the server like poking around by myself.
Sure.
And I'm not the right person to develop like the fastest, most efficient algorithm that you could write. But I am absolutely going to be there beside the people who are doing it and understand what they need to do that more effectively and be that person to connect those dots to make that space whatever's needed. And I think that is sometimes requires an understanding of the technical domains that those people work in, but it's more about the empathy for what they are doing than it is about being able to say, do this thing, or like, I know I could do it too. Get out of my way. Like, I'll just do it. It's not about that. And
1000%. Well, so I think the first time somebody said that in modern recorded business history was Henry Ford, who apparently when in the witness stand, somebody was a lawyer was trying to discredit him, saying that you don't know anything about your own business. And, give me this stat, give me that stat. He was being cross-examined. And Henry Ford said, my job's not to know this. My job is to tell you who in my company will give you the best answers. That's my job, and really, really humiliated the cross-examining counsel for that. And it's the same principle, our expectations need to change. And this is another thing that I think holds engineering managers back, or managers anywhere, is that they feel this tension between what the job demands for success and what they believe their direct reports expect from them in terms of their technical qualifications. Like, it's almost a shameful thing to say, well, I haven't actually been on the tools for a while. I don't know. You tell me. To me, that's a very empowering thing to tell a direct report. You're probably the expert, not me. What do you need me to do to unblock you? Right?
Right.
That's the conversation we should be having, because that's the only way they'll grow. And that's the only way the manager is freed up to do the strategic stuff.
I'm curious. I want to throw maybe a bit of a curveball into this conversation about like manager expectations. And I want to be totally transparent. I agree with everything you're saying about, I think these expectations like need to evolve. But I think what we're probably discussing is what I might think of as more ideal circumstances. And what I mean by that is like established company, we got, we're selling products, we got things going, we got services, we're building teams, like things are steady state and going pretty well. And you have experience outside of this too. So I want to kind of hear your input, but what about situations where you have a startup? What about situations where you need to be wearing a lot of hats? Is there perhaps, especially in the tech space, I can't comment on other domains because I don't have experience there, but I wonder if in the tech space, we're perpetuating some of this, like, okay, you're a manager, but like, what are you going to do? You got 3 people on your team that you're managing. Are you just going to sit back, or are you going to roll up your sleeves and code with the team? Like, I'm curious if like maybe some of that starts to perpetuate it because there's enough smaller companies where maybe that is kind of necessary, but just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and it's a great question. So, and I don't want anyone to sort of misinterpret what's being discussed here as okay to not be technically strong. That's not what we're saying. Right?
This is always a difficult thing when you're trying to put out thoughts. So someone's going to be in the comments being like, I can't believe you said that. And it's like, it's not
correct. I remember putting something on LinkedIn saying DSA is not as important as you think. And they're like, well, what would you do instead? I'm like, I didn't say instead. I said it's not as important as you think. I didn't say don't do it.
Yeah,
that's what
you said. You said don't ever know anything. And
exactly. Now, I think, these are nuanced things. And I guess the good way to that I try to approach this, which I've learned really the hard way, is I used to think in terms of good this, bad that. Good this, bad that. Strong this, weak this. And now I only have one word, either effective or not. Like, it's as simple as that, right? And I remember maybe about 20-something years ago when the tsunami happened. Oh, no, that wasn't 20-something years ago. That was 2010. So that was 14, 15 years ago. When the tsunami happened, I remember a friend of mine telling me how different the practice of medicine was in the field compared to a hospital.
Okay.
Right. Same skill set, just different context. And she was like, you don't get to do some of the things you can do. You don't always have sterile equipment. You don't always have the luxury of being able to fill up a clipboard with, you can't. You got to do what the job demands. And that's really what drove home to me my mental model of what effective is. That you don't know which company has what need, what team, what project. It's all very context specific, right? And so the question is not, are you good or not? Because there's always people better than you. There's always people worse than you. So this concept of good is kind of useless. You're either effective or you're not.
Yeah.
So either you can get the job done, or you say you can't get the job done. And I've been in that situation. I can't get the job done because I don't know enough, right? Who do I need to speak to? Like the first 4 months at Google was a complete crushing, soul crushing in terms of my ability to think that I was going to be good at anything. Because I'm like, I had total panic. I mean, I'd come from web dev at a startup with 4 people where we didn't even have CI/CD. Okay, that's what I came in from, into this world where everything's in the cloud, the world's largest mono repo. I didn't even understand what was going on. And I'm like, I am never going to cope with this. Okay. And I was given a task and I said, I'll try and do it in the next 2 weeks. It took me almost 3.5 months. Okay. That's when I realized why my manager was so great, is because he was cool and calm. And he's like, what do you need? What do you need next? What do you need next? What do you need next? And by the way, this is okay. This is not unnatural. It's not like you're not trying. You don't know what you don't know. So now we've got to fill in those gaps systematically, step by step, brick by brick, build that wall, right? And so I went from being ineffective to effective. It took longer than I wanted, but I wasn't asking myself whether I'm good enough or good. I trusted that the process would bring me into the company if I was good enough, but that doesn't mean that I'll know everything, right? That doesn't mean that I'm going to come out fully born, fully shaped, right? Like, so effective is how I'd break that down, Nick, is either you're effective for what the job demands or you're not.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, the context can shape that a lot, right? So if you're in a small company and it's like, we need to get things cranked out, it's like, okay, well, it's almost maybe zooming out from that too. It's like not even your own effectiveness, but like stepping back and looking at what's required, right? Like maybe I'm just going to throw out like a different sort of direction here. Like maybe the most effective thing you could do is say, I should be looking to hire someone. Like maybe that is an effective thing based on the time frame and all of that, and you can apply your skills a better way and there's budget. But maybe the most effective thing is shorter term. You're like, I need to code alongside the team because I'm not going to hire someone in 3 days and we have a deadline. Like,
okay, but that's not a management skill, right? That's a need. That's not saying we have to have a manager who is technical. We have to have someone fill a role who can solve this technical problem. And if they're trying to kind of bridge that with, we have a few people who are more junior and need someone to people lead them, that's different than I'm peer coding or I'm kind of lead engineering with these people. And,
that's right.
And so that's where I don't think like you have to have these strong technical skills to be an effective manager, but there are times when a management role, especially in context of small companies, it requires more. When I worked at a small startup, we weren't the smallest startup, I guess. We had a couple of teams, but the teams were like 2-3 people each, so like relatively small. And when I got hired, they said, there's an expectation that the manager will spend some of the time technically contributing. And, I said, that's fine. I'm not the strongest engineer. I'm the first to say that. I know I'm not classically trained in engineering. I'm very self-taught. But I said, like, fine, I'll do what I have to do. I'll be on the on-call rotation, whatever. But when I got there, I realized really quickly that I could be more effective building processes that would helping the engineers be more effective and making that time 3x better by making everyone better than just contributing code. And
Absolutely.
And I don't recommend this across the board, but I actually just started doing that stuff. And so there was this expectation, like you'll technically contribute to all the managers, to all 2 or 3. And I just kind of didn't. I just did what made the team better, and the team got better and better and delivered more and more. And it got to the point where it came up in conversation with the CTO. And I said, yeah, I'm pursuing putting some light agile frameworks in place, understanding where the bottlenecks are and figuring out, how we can help the engineers overcome them efficiently. Shortly after that, all the engineers were managers were pulled into a meeting, and the conversation was, hey, shift in expectations. I want you doing less coding and more of this. And I think it was like the people in charge at that time were probably of the mindset that we need strong technical managers who can technically contribute, because they thought that's what the role required. But when they realized there was efficiency to be had by having people focusing on the efficiency of the engineers, they were willing to support that. So
1,000. And so that exact phrase that he said, that shift in expectations, is what we can take for granted is going to happen in every role, right? You be in the role long enough, there's going to be a shift in expectations, in which case you don't know what you're going to need or what you're going to have to be good at. You can't possibly know that, except for the point in time, that snapshot in time when you're first hired. That's probably the most certainty you're going to have. And then over time, especially if you're in a fast growth area, less so if you're in a very mature organization that, it's the same thing over and over again. And this is why there's a huge difference between people with 5 years experience and people with 1 year experience 5 times over. It's a huge difference, right? We know people like this. I've got 5 years of experience, yes, but is it the 1 year 5 times over, or is it actually 5 years of experience, right? And so the more things change, the more experience you get. And the more things change, the less likely you're going to have the skills necessary for the next iteration of that role, for the next shift in expectation. And that's okay, because that's where the growth mindset comes in. What do I not know? How can I get it? That's it.
And I think this idea that you've brought up, right? Like, I think one of my really core takeaways from the conversation is like these meta principles. You've said it multiple times, and I think that ties in perfectly to what you were just saying. If you can learn and understand meta principles, have these abstractions, these frameworks that apply to not just engineering, not just your specific role or job, like these are like, I don't have enough background or context to say like they're laws or anything, right? But they're concepts, and you can reapply them to different things. If you have an understanding of that, you're in a position where as your expectations are changing, you're not like, well, I guess I don't have the skill, I'm screwed. Like, you can start thinking like, how do I adapt? Like, how would I like use meta principles to start evolving to be able to kind of fit that need? Or maybe you're in a position where you're like, this is now like, it's uncomfortable, and you can do that reflection to say like, is it time to, pivot to something else? But if you don't have these meta principles, like you end up feeling stuck, and maybe you're like kind of, curl up into a ball and you're like, this is it.
1,000%. And, I'm like, I think Graham's suggestion, culture code, I've got it up on the screen. I'm going to pick it up. So thank you for that. The meta principles thinking came to me from the late Charlie Munger, and he figured this out in his 20s, which was a long time ago. He, passed away in his 90s, and he was in his 20s a long, long time ago. And, from his book, I think it's called Thinking in Frameworks. But his entire, again, it was to do with finance and share investing, but it applies to everything in life. And this is his point. Like, if you think in certain frameworks, which are meta principles, there's a pattern to life. There is a pattern to success. There is a pattern to struggle. There is a pattern to effort. There's a pattern to agriculture. There's a pattern to code, right? There are books on coding patterns. There's a pattern to things. And that's all meta principles are. It's isolating the pattern, finding it from, separating the signal from the noise, and saying, well, is this repeating through time and context? In which case there's a greater, broader principle to be extracted here. And there are no universal rules. So you look at sun rises in the east. Not true. My folks live in Norway, and in the north of Norway, it rises and sets in the north. The further you are to the poles, the less easterly it is, right?
Right.
Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. I think that's 200 and something Fahrenheit. That's true at low altitude. At high altitude, that's not true anymore. Like, these universal rules are contextual too, and that's kind of life. That's kind of the fun of life, if you ask me, is figuring out the patterns.
So something I think is a little bit unfortunate about leadership, and it might be true across industries, but it's certainly true, or at least observed in engineering, is most organizations are really clear about the expectations of their IC roles. And when what skills you don't have, there are opportunities to get that. And what's interesting is most organizations don't support people very well once they get into management. And I suspect the people who are successful in being good leaders or good managers are the ones who are able to do what you're talking about and identify reaching beyond just their career professional experience to say, hey, this worked over here and maybe it'll work in context here because I'm working with people. But for me, something that is a bit of a takeaway, I think about this often, but this is forcing me to think if I'm actually doing any good job at all about applying it, is as I'm trying to grow other leaders on the team, like not just role modeling, but what am I doing to actually share like leadership skills growth? Hey, you've kind of hit your ceiling in coding. There's tons more if you want to stay on that track and learn more technical skills. But if you want to come into this leadership side, we have to also provide opportunities for people to grow and learn this as an organization. And there's this weird expectation that you become a manager and you will know how to manage people and you'll be successful at it. And if you're not, your team's not effective and therefore you're a failure and you're probably let go or deemed not performant in your role. But where does the support come from? And I think that's, at least when we get to the level of being a manager of managers or like a leader who is trying to grow people into leadership roles, I think we have to reflect long and hard on, are we giving people as much support in that space as we are in here? Learn these coding languages, learn these frameworks, and you'll be successful.
Well, I think that's what you and Nick are doing with, Dude, Where's My Code? I think that's the whole point of this, is where the reason why organizations probably struggle, well, especially younger ones struggle with defining what success looks like for management is, again, it's the same old determinism problem. It's not deterministic. And we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how this is going to work. So how are we going to tell you what target to shoot at, right? But again, there are patterns to this. So, some of the other people you've had in this podcast, and over time, as you sort of speak to more people, you guys and your listeners will see the pattern. There is a pattern here that can be extrapolated across multiple engineering management experiences that hopefully this show is going to sort of distill and bring together. And that then becomes the transaction Bible, I was going to say, the playbook, the playbook for the meta principles relating to engineering management, in which case it's not locked into a company anymore. Right. It's available for it's a library of resources that people can use and mix and match from different contexts, right? Which is a far greater service than siloing it in a company, because no one person's going to have the answer.
Right. Yeah. Again, the whole meta principle concept, I think, is totally awesome. So I'm glad that we got to do this and go back and forth on this, because I know, like, if it's not going to be super engineering focused, like, it was so cool that you were able to bring so many of these different experiences, and we can still apply them to engineering, but having this lens into, like, sure, you see it in engineering this way, like, here's a parallel, right? Like, having that example, here's a parallel, is so powerful to be like, wait, we said this earlier, right? Like, maybe we're not special. Like, yeah.
And imagine if you could reason by analogy from everything that happens in the world rather than just your domain. Like, right. Just imagine the creativity that's possible when you reason by analogy from other things, right?
Absolutely.
It just opens up the amount of innovation that's come up from biomimicry, which is just imitating what biology and nature does, is extraordinary. You've pulled it across from biology into some of the material sciences domain, right? And it works. It works beautifully, right? That's how creativity comes about, is this cross-pollination. Right. And it's all meta principles.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. So Zubin, if people want to hear more from you, I'll ask you after for links and stuff. We'll make sure we put it into descriptions and all that. But can you give us like where people can head to like, is it Twitter, LinkedIn, website? Like, give us a rundown.
So I'm mainly on LinkedIn. I have some Twitter presence, but mainly on LinkedIn. I have a small Nation YouTube channel and podcast there. I'll drop all the links for you in the show notes. Awesome. And for those who are interested in career change, I have another site for that. But that's only for those who are interested in that kind of stuff. And it's not for everybody. We need to sort of be very careful and mindful about that. It's not for everybody. You have to do things safely. But yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way to reach me. And what I like about LinkedIn is people have to use their own names. And so they can't hide behind the anonymous cowardliness that we see on the internet a lot. So
that's right. I changed my LinkedIn name to Mark Zuckerberg. So that's but LinkedIn's a great opportunity for that. So like I said, we'll make sure we get links and stuff for you. So for folks watching, please check pinned comment and/or description for that. Zubin, thank you so much. This was super insightful. Graeme and I always say when we have guests come on, it's like we love learning from each other, but we know when a guest comes on, we're like, oh yeah, we're going to be learning. So this is great.
Well, thank you guys for the opportunity and, for the book recommendation. I've learned a lot as well, but most importantly, thank you for even identifying the need for this kind of podcast, because what you guys are doing is so important, because it's a freaking lonely journey to go from IC to manager in anything, especially in in a domain that's steeped in all sorts of lore, intellectual sort of constraints about what, the value system is so strongly embedded about. You got to be technically really strong. It's a very uniquely coding culture thing, and I think we need to liberate ourselves from that so that more people can be the best version of themselves. And that, I think that's what you guys are ultimately doing, is helping people be the best version of themselves in a coding context. So, hats off to you guys.
Thank you so much. And for viewers, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.